There's a moment that happens on roads all over the world, thousands of times every single day. A driver sees flashing red and blue lights in the rearview mirror, the heart rate jumps, hands tighten on the steering wheel, and suddenly, a simple drive home turns into something far more serious. For most people, it feels like a minor inconvenience, a quick traffic stop, maybe a warning, maybe a ticket. But for thousands of drivers every year, something unexpected happens in those few minutes on the roadside, a simple decision, a small misunderstanding, or one sentence spoken at the wrong moment, and suddenly, what could have ended with a warning becomes a court date, not because the driver was necessarily dangerous, not because they intended to break the law, but because of a legal mistake that many drivers make without even realizing it. Before we go any further, think about this for a moment. If a police officer pulled you over tonight and asked you questions about what happened, would you know exactly what to say? Or, more importantly, would you know what not to say? Let me know in the comments what you think the biggest mistake drivers make during traffic stops might be, because the answer might surprise you. To understand why this mistake sends so many drivers to court every year, we need to start with something most people rarely think about: the legal structure of a traffic stop. Most drivers see a traffic stop as a simple interaction. An officer pulls you over. You answer a few questions. Maybe you get a ticket. Then you leave. But legally speaking, a traffic stop is something very different. In the eyes of the law, it is considered a temporary detention. That means the officer has stopped your freedom of movement for a specific legal reason. This principle comes from decades of legal precedent, particularly rulings that balance two important goals: allowing police to enforce traffic laws while also protecting the constitutional rights of individuals. Courts have consistently held that traffic stops must be based on what is called reasonable suspicion. In simple terms, an officer must have a specific reason to believe that a traffic violation or other offense occurred. This could be something obvious, like speeding, running a red light, or failing to signal. It could also be something more subtle, like a broken tail light or expired registration. Once the stop begins, the officer is allowed to ask certain questions and request specific documents. Typically, drivers are required to provide their license, vehicle registration, and proof of insurance. That part is straightforward, but here is where things start to become complicated. Because the next few moments during a traffic stop are where many drivers unknowingly create legal problems for themselves. Imagine a typical scenario. A driver is pulled over for allegedly rolling through a stop sign. The officer approaches the window and asks a very simple question. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Most drivers respond immediately. Some apologize, some explain, some say something like, "I'm sorry, I didn't see the sign." And in everyday life, that might seem like the polite and reasonable thing to do. But legally speaking, that single sentence can carry enormous consequences, because in many cases, that statement can be interpreted as an admission. And admissions, even casual ones made during roadside conversations, can become evidence. This is something many drivers don't realize. Traffic court cases often rely heavily on what was said during the initial stop, not just what the officer observed, but what the driver admitted. For example, if a driver says, "I think I was going a little fast," that statement can later appear in the officer's report. If the case goes to court, that statement might be presented as an acknowledgement of speeding. Now imagine how that might affect the outcome of the case. The court is no longer evaluating only the officer's observation. It now also has a statement from the driver that appears to confirm the violation. This doesn't mean drivers should be rude, hostile, or uncooperative. In fact, respectful behavior during traffic stops is always the best approach. But understanding the legal context of the conversation can make a major difference. And this brings us to one of the most common legal mistakes drivers make every year: talking too much. It sounds simple, but this mistake happens constantly. When people are nervous, they tend to explain, they try to justify what happened, they offer extra details. They attempt to persuade the officer that the situation wasn't serious. But every additional sentence creates more potential evidence, and once those words are spoken, they can't be taken back. Legal professionals who work in traffic defense see this pattern over and over again. A driver receives a citation. Later, when they consult a lawyer, they explain what happened. And somewhere in the story, there is usually a moment during the stop when the driver said something that unintentionally strengthened the case against them. Sometimes it's an apology, sometimes it's an explanation, sometimes it's an offhand comment that seemed harmless at the time, but in court, those words matter. And this raises an interesting question. Why do so many drivers feel compelled to explain themselves during traffic stops? Part of the answer lies in human psychology. Most people naturally want to resolve conflict. When someone in authority confronts us about a mistake, our instinct is often to clarify or defend ourselves. We want the other person to understand our perspective. We want them to see that we're reasonable people. But legal systems don't operate the same way casual conversations do. In a legal context, information becomes evidence. Statements become part of the record. and explanations can sometimes be interpreted very differently from how they were intended. This doesn't mean officers are trying to trick drivers. In fact, many officers simply ask routine questions as part of the interaction, but the legal consequences of those conversations can extend far beyond the roadside. Traffic courts across many countries process enormous numbers of cases every year. In the United States alone, estimates suggest that tens of millions of traffic citations are issued annually. Many of those citations lead to fines, points on licenses, increased insurance costs, and sometimes mandatory court appearances. And while some cases involve serious violations, many begin with relatively minor infractions. Rolling stops, speeding slightly above the limit, equipment violations, things that happen to ordinary drivers every day. But when cases escalate to court, the details of the initial stop often become critical. What the officer observed, what the driver said, what the body camera recorded, what was written in the incident report, all of these pieces come together to form the legal narrative of the case, and that narrative often begins with a few brief minutes on the side of the road. Now think about your own driving experiences. Have you ever been pulled over? If so, how did you react in that moment? Did you try to explain what happened? Did you apologize? Or did you stay quiet and simply provide the required documents? Share your experience in the comments, because hearing real stories from drivers helps reveal how common these situations really are. Another factor that contributes to this widespread legal mistake is the difference between everyday communication and legal communication. In normal conversation, honesty and openness are usually positive qualities. We're taught that being transparent helps resolve misunderstandings, but legal interactions are structured differently. The purpose of a traffic stop is not to conduct a casual conversation. It is to investigate a potential violation. That doesn't mean drivers should be dishonest or evasive, but it does mean that every statement made during the interaction has legal weight. This is one reason many lawyers advise clients to keep answers brief and focused during official encounters. Provide the required documents, respond respectfully if necessary, but avoid volunteering unnecessary information. Because once extra information enters the conversation, it becomes part of the official record, and records have a way of following cases all the way to court. Over the years, many well-known legal cases have highlighted how seemingly small statements can affect the outcome of traffic stops. Courts frequently examine whether officers had reasonable suspicion for the stop, whether the detention lasted longer than legally permitted, and whether any evidence was obtained lawfully. But when drivers themselves provide statements that appear to confirm a violation, those statements can significantly influence the court's evaluation. And that brings us to another important aspect of this issue. Most drivers assume traffic cases are straightforward. You either broke the rule or you didn't. But in reality, traffic law can be surprisingly complex. Speed measurement methods, sign visibility, road markings, equipment calibration, officer observations. Each of these factors can become relevant during a legal challenge. But when a driver has already acknowledged the violation during the stop, many of those legal arguments become far more difficult to raise later. This is why legal professionals often emphasize awareness, not fear, not confrontation, just awareness, understanding the structure of the interaction, understanding the difference between required cooperation and unnecessary explanation, and understanding how quickly a routine stop can become a legal case. If you think about it, this issue isn't really about traffic law alone. It's about how ordinary conversations intersect with legal systems. And that intersection can sometimes produce unexpected consequences. Every year, thousands of drivers find themselves sitting in courtrooms waiting for their case to be called. Some are there because of serious violations, but many are there because of situations that began with something very small. A minor traffic stop, a quick conversation, a sentence spoken without much thought, and suddenly, the legal system is involved. The fascinating part is that many of those cases might have unfolded very differently if that initial conversation had gone another way, which raises another question worth thinking about. If you knew that a single sentence during a traffic stop could influence a court case weeks or months later, would you handle that conversation differently? Think about it, and if you've ever had a traffic stop that turned into something bigger than you expected, share your story below, because understanding these everyday legal moments helps all of us become more aware drivers. And awareness, as simple as it sounds, can make an enormous difference when flashing lights appear in the rearview mirror. There is another moment during a traffic stop that often passes almost unnoticed, yet it quietly shapes what may happen next. After the initial questions, after the driver provides a license and registration, the conversation sometimes shifts. The officer might ask where the driver is coming from, where they are headed, how fast they believe they were driving, whether they noticed the speed limit. To most people, these sound like simple conversational questions, polite, even routine. But legally speaking, these questions serve a purpose. They help officers gather context about the situation. Sometimes they clarify whether a violation occurred. Sometimes they help determine whether the stop should end with a warning, a citation, or something more serious. And once again, many drivers respond instinctively. They try to explain. They try to justify. They try to convince the officer that the situation was harmless. Imagine a driver who says something like, "I was just trying to get home quickly," or "I might have been going a little over the limit." From a human perspective, these are understandable responses. They show honesty, they show cooperation. But in legal terms, statements like these can unintentionally strengthen the case against the driver, because once those words become part of an officer's report, they can later appear in court as evidence that the driver acknowledged the violation. It's one of the most subtle but powerful dynamics in traffic law. And it explains why traffic defense attorneys often emphasize something that seems almost counterintuitive. Not confrontation, not argument, but restraint. Restraint in what is said during the stop. Restraint in offering explanations that may not be legally necessary. Restraint in turning a brief encounter into a detailed conversation. The reason is simple. Traffic stops are often recorded. Many police vehicles now use dashboard cameras. Many officers wear body cameras. These recordings capture not only the events of the stop, but also the words spoken during it. And when cases reach court, those recordings sometimes become central pieces of evidence. Judges review them, attorneys analyze them. Every statement can be replayed and interpreted in the context of the law. For drivers who believe the interaction was just a quick roadside conversation, this realization can be surprising. But it reflects the reality of modern law enforcement. Technology has changed how traffic stops are documented. In the past, many cases relied primarily on written reports. Today, audio and video recordings often accompany those reports. This has improved transparency and accountability in many ways, but it has also made the details of roadside conversations more legally significant than ever before. Now consider another common moment that occurs during many traffic stops. An officer issues a citation, the driver signs it, and the encounter ends. At this stage, many drivers assume that signing the ticket means admitting guilt, but in most jurisdictions that is not actually the case. Signing a citation typically means something much simpler. It means the driver acknowledges receipt of the ticket and agrees to address it through the legal process, which may involve paying the fine or appearing in court. The signature itself usually does not mean the driver agrees with the allegation, yet confusion about this step sometimes causes drivers to argue during the stop. They may refuse to sign. They may believe signing automatically means accepting guilt, and this misunderstanding can complicate the interaction unnecessarily. In many places, refusing to sign a citation may even lead to additional consequences, including arrest in some situations. Again, this highlights an important theme. Traffic stops involve a structured legal process. Understanding that process helps drivers navigate the interaction calmly and effectively. Without that understanding, even well-intentioned reactions can escalate the situation. Another factor that often surprises drivers is how small traffic violations can sometimes reveal larger legal issues. For example, an officer who stops a vehicle for speeding may also run the driver's license through a database. This check might reveal an expired license, outstanding fines, suspended driving privileges, or other administrative issues that the driver may not have realized were still active. Suddenly, what began as a minor speeding stop becomes a more complex legal situation, and this is another reason why traffic stops sometimes lead to court appearances. Not necessarily because of the initial violation, but because the stop uncovers something else. Courts see this pattern frequently. Drivers arrive believing they are addressing one issue, only to discover that the legal process has expanded beyond what they expected. And when you step back and look at the bigger picture, it becomes clear that traffic law plays a much larger role in everyday life than most people realize. Driving is one of the most common activities people engage in. Millions of vehicles travel roads every day. To maintain safety and order, societies create detailed rules governing how those roads are used. Speed limits, signage requirements, vehicle equipment standards, licensing systems, insurance laws. These regulations form a complex legal framework designed to protect everyone who uses the road. But because driving feels routine, many people rarely think about the legal structure behind it. Until, of course, the moment flashing lights appear in the mirror. That moment changes everything. What felt like an ordinary drive suddenly becomes a formal legal interaction. And that interaction may last only a few minutes, yet the consequences can stretch weeks or months into the future. Court dates, insurance adjustments, license points, fines, sometimes even mandatory driving courses, all triggered by a brief event on the roadside. Now think again about the central mistake we've been exploring. Not speeding, not missing a stop sign, but something much more subtle. The legal mistake of unintentionally building the case against yourself through casual conversation. It happens quietly, no dramatic moment, no warning, just a few words spoken during a stressful interaction, and later those words appear in a report, a recording, or a courtroom discussion. This is why awareness is so important. Not fear of law enforcement, not hostility, but simple understanding of how legal systems operate. When drivers understand the structure of traffic stops, they are better prepared to handle the interaction calmly and respectfully. They know which documents to provide. They know that signing a ticket usually acknowledges receipt, not guilt. And they know that unnecessary explanations can sometimes complicate matters. This knowledge doesn't turn drivers into legal experts, but it gives them something valuable: clarity. Clarity reduces stress. Clarity helps people respond thoughtfully rather than react emotionally. And thoughtful responses often lead to smoother interactions for everyone involved. If you think about it, traffic stops are unique moments where everyday life intersects directly with the legal system. Most people rarely interact with courts, judges, or formal legal procedures, but traffic law brings that system directly into daily life. One moment you're driving to work or heading home from the store. The next moment you're participating in a legal encounter governed by specific rules and procedures. Understanding that reality can change how people approach the experience. Instead of panic or confusion, there is awareness. Instead of rushed explanations, there is calm cooperation. And that shift can make an enormous difference. Now I want to ask you something again. Have you ever said something during a stressful moment and later wished you had handled the conversation differently? Maybe during a disagreement, maybe during a professional situation, maybe during a traffic stop. It's something almost everyone has experienced. Words spoken quickly, without much thought, that later carry more weight than expected. Traffic stops simply place that human tendency inside a legal framework. And the results can sometimes lead all the way to courtrooms. But there is another side to this story as well. Traffic enforcement is not just about penalties. It plays a significant role in public safety. Studies across many countries consistently show that enforcement of traffic laws reduces accidents, injuries, and fatalities. Speed limits exist because higher speeds increase the severity of crashes. Seatbelt laws exist because they save lives. Equipment regulations exist because functioning lights and brakes prevent accidents. In that sense, traffic stops are not merely legal encounters. They are part of a broader system designed to keep roads safe for everyone. Drivers, passengers, cyclists, pedestrians. The goal is not simply enforcement. The goal is prevention. Preventing dangerous behavior before it leads to tragedy. And when viewed from that perspective, traffic law becomes something more meaningful than tickets or fines. It becomes part of a collective effort to protect human life on roads that millions of people share every day. But even within that system, the human element remains central. Drivers are human. Officers are human. Mistakes happen. Misunderstandings happen. Conversations unfold in unpredictable ways. And sometimes small moments have larger consequences than anyone expected. Which brings us back to where we began, that brief moment when flashing lights appear in the rearview mirror, a moment that may last only seconds. Yet in that moment, a driver's choices can shape everything that follows. Will the interaction remain a routine stop, or will it become the beginning of a legal case? For thousands of drivers every year, the difference often comes down to something surprisingly simple. Understanding how the conversation works, understanding what the law actually requires, and understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do during a legal interaction is simply remain calm, respectful, and measured in what they say. Because the truth is, most traffic stops end without drama. Most drivers go on with their day, but the ones that don't often share a common thread. A legal mistake that felt insignificant at the time. A few words spoken in a moment of stress, and later a court date that might have been avoided. So the next time you're on the road, think about this question. Not just how you drive, but how you would respond if that unexpected moment happened. If the lights appeared behind you, if the officer approached your window, if the conversation began. Would you know how to handle it calmly and thoughtfully? Or would stress take over the moment? Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a traffic stop that taught you something about how the legal system works? Your experiences may help others understand these situations better, because awareness spreads through conversation. And sometimes, the most valuable lessons about the law come not from textbooks or courtrooms, but from the everyday moments we all experience on the road. Drive safely, stay aware. And remember that understanding the law is not about avoiding responsibility. It's about navigating everyday situations with clarity, respect, and confidence.